So let's talk about boundaries. People really like categorizing things, sorting them into little boxes. Chocolate or vanilla, horse or zebra, hot or mild. But not everything can get nicely solved in this way. A lot of things in the world exist along a spectrum. It might seem like deciding what counts as a language should be an easy question, but when it comes down to it, it's often more a matter of politics than a science. I'm Model Lieberman, and this is the Link Space. So defining what exactly language is can be quite challenging. But one approach is to say that it's a consistent way people have to communicate with each other. If someone speaks the same language as you, then you should be able to understand what they're saying without too much trouble. But even within what we consider the same language, there can be lots of variation in how it's used. So between people in one place or another, or in one socioeconomic class or another, or even of one gender or another, we call subtypes of the same language dialects. But actually, the border that divides a language from a dialect isn't really clear. So for example, Norwegian and Swedish are pretty unanimously thought of as different languages, but speakers of these two languages are totally able to understand each other. Same things with Hindi and Urdu. Each language is intelligible to the people who speak the other one. On the other hand, you have Mandarin and Cantonese, which are often thought of as two dialects of the Chinese language, except that all speakers of one can't understand the other. The phonology, the vocabulary, the syntax, it's all quite different. Mandarin and Cantonese have way less in common than Norwegian and Swedish. So, what's going on with these pairings? Well, it turns out that whether a particular variety of speech is called as language or a dialect isn't strictly speaking as a matter of linguistics. There's no council of linguists that gets together and say, hey, look, how different this dialect is. We better break this dialect off and make it a new language. No, usually it's determined by sociopolitical criteria. As Max Weinreich famously said, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. But keeping that in mind, let's take a look at what linguists might actually say about classifying dialects and languages. Every dialect, every way of communicating is based on an internal grammar, stored in the brain, with a full-fledged set of rules for how to structure its sounds and sentences. So, in that sense, every single dialect could be thought of as a separate language. But using the word dialects that way would be confusing, and it wouldn't capture the connection between the different varieties in question. So instead, linguists use the word dialect to mean closely related varieties of the language, thus with significant overlap in the word they use, and also in their phonology, morphology, and syntax. Even if they're different, if they have that much in common, they should be mutually intelligible, which is how we should define dialects. Looking at it more broadly, dialects are the sum of the linguistic characteristics within a given community. But there are a lot of different ways to define community. Age can enter into it. Most of us don't sound like our grandparents when we talk, or pick up a book from hundreds of years ago, or even 50, and you'll see that the way that we say things has changed a lot. Many languages also have real differences in the way man and woman tend to speak, different vocabulary and pronunciation, and even syntax. Even the way you refer to yourself can be different. Japanese speakers might say atashi if they're female, but ore if they're male. And a lot of more factors also can come into play: race, class, religion, or even what you do for a living. But for now, let's focus on one really important factor in what makes a dialect: geography. You might have seen those cool maps that show how people vary in their pronunciation and word choice. So, a large region of the USA caramel with two syllables, except for a big swath of the East Coast and Southeast, where they say caramel. Or the word miracle, which is pronounced the way I just said, and except in unconnected areas like Houston, Boston, Central Georgia, and most of the Utah, where they say miracle. You can have hours of fun looking at this. But the point here is that a widespread language like English or Spanish or French or whatever literally has hundreds of dialects. Linguists still end up calling them dialects because a speaker of English from like New Jersey can still understand one from California or even one from Newcastle with a little bit of practice. But even though they're mutually intelligible, every dialect of English and of every other language has its own fully developed, fully functional mental grammar. Each one is a complete version of the language. Now, there's no reason why any speaker should be limited to only having one dialect. In fact, most people trying to match whoever they're talking to and whatever they're talking about, either on purpose or not. Think about how you talk about your grandmother or your boss compared to how you talk with your friends or your teeny little cousin. So, even if we're not bilingual, most of us are probably bi-dialectal, at least. But even if you speak more than one dialect, you probably think one of them is better than the other. People talk a lot about dialects deviating from the standard. Even the term dialect is often seen as less prestigious. Some languages have a formally defined standard, like French or Hindi or Arabic. The varieties that are not the standard version get called dialects, and they usually come with less social prestige. Social attitudes about language really start to come out when we talk about dialect. Language prejudice is a form of discrimination and can sometimes act as a shield for racism. As a society, we've rightly decided to single someone out for the color of their skin or for what they believe in is wrong, but often discriminating against how someone speaks feels safer. Just look at the tumultuous histories of African American vernacular English and the Quebec variety of spoken French. Fortunately, our societies have been developing a broader understanding of the linguistic richness of this dialect. Unfortunately, contempt and prejudice towards these non-standard varieties is still surprisingly common. There are still a lot of people who think of African American vernacular English as grammatically deficient or sloppy and lazy speech, or that people in Quebec don't speak proper French or lack grammar. But from a linguist perspective, this is completely super wrong. Let's look at a couple of examples from Quebec France. Now, Quebec France differ from standard European France in a bunch of interesting ways. So, vocabulary of course, but also in its phonology and syntax. For example, when you get t or d and it's followed by a vowel like e or that's pronounced high up and front in the mouth, that t or d turns into either s or z. So let's say you want to inform your friends that T-Rex is tapping on a little house. In France, you could say T-Rex pile sur une petite maison. In Quebec stuff, it sounds like this: T-Rex pile sur une petite maison. This is a process called affrication, and it happens in a lot of language. Japanese doesn't even natively have the sound combination T and tu. Instead, it uses the affricates chi and su. Or look at how Quebec France make questions. Let's say you want to ask about whether the devil is playing video games. In European French, you would say, Est-ce que diable joue video? But in Quebec France, the question isn't made that way. It's made using a question marking particle that comes after the auxiliary verbs. So, there's like, Le diable joue joue video. Now, that might not be okay for standard French speakers, but it's a totally legitimate grammatical options. If you look at the other languages, you see lots of them using question marking particle like that, like in Korean or Mandarin, and would never say it's wrong to do it there. From a linguistic perspective, Quebec French is every bit as complex and correct as any other version of the language. Let's just put it very simply. There is no scientific basis for valuing one dialect of a language over any other, just like our decision about what qualifies as a language or as a dialect. These decisions are social and political. When we think about who decided what's standard English or proper French, we can see it's those with the power and prestige in society. But when we look at the variation within a language, we see all the dialects are valid. All of them are complex and interesting and worthy of our study. To a linguist, all languages are beautiful. It's a wonderful linguist world out there for all of the flavors of language. So we've reached the end of the link space for this week. If you weren't hung up on linguistic prejudices, you will learn that deciding what's a language and what's a dialect is more political than linguistic. That if we give a linguistic definition of dialects, it will be different versions of a language that are comprehensible to each other. That languages vary by age, class, gender, and region. That all varieties of language are built on the same foundation of grammar and are all equally valid, and thus to think otherwise is a form of prejudice. The Link Space is produced by me, Motil Berman. It's directed by Adel Elias Prevost, and it's written by both of us. Our production assistant is George Colum. Our music and sound design by Shane Turner, and our graphic team is Atelier Muse. We're down in the comment below, or you can bring the discussion back over to our website, where we have some extra material on this topic. Check us out on Tumblr, Twitter, and Facebook. If you want to keep expanding your own personal link space, please subscribe. And we'll see you next Wednesday. Tali Misindoma.